Kindly unmute yourself.
I do have a couple of slides, but mostly I was just going to talk because where this comes in the presentations that I usually give about information management in general, I'm just talking. There's a bullet, but I just talk about it. So that's what I propose to do. But I will show just a couple of slides afterwards, after the initial bits, about the value of information, because Ken mentioned that, and I have found the slides for that. So I want to propose a conjecture to you, which is that disasters are caused, generally at least, by a lack of information or a lack of information of appropriate quality. So I guess there are two questions that you ought to ask about that. One of them's, what's a disaster? And why is it that information management and information of the right quality would make a difference? So let's talk about a disaster. And I think I would say that just because something happens, it's not necessarily a disaster. So let's take the example of a volcano erupting in some very remote place where there are no people within 100 miles. Is it a disaster when a volcano erupts in that situation? I suggest not. That's just nature doing its stuff. However, if the same volcano erupts and at the foot of the volcano there's a large conurbation, and that conurbation gets showered with ash and destroyed by the magma from the volcano, then that is a disaster. So it's a disaster when it has a bad impact on us, not just something happening. It has to impact us in a particularly serious way, and probably if we've labelled it a disaster, there's a loss of life. But it could just be something that's very expensive. So the usual example that people give of a disaster that's just very expensive is the moon lander one, where the problem was that there were two software modules, and for whatever reason, one was using imperial measures and the other was using metric measures. And so when they communicated with each other, they took the wrong action and plummeted into Mars rather than landing softly. And that's clearly something that's wrong about the way the information was processed and the way that it was handled, and there's a clear mismatch in terms of the units that were expected for the, indeed, and the units weren't even exchanged, presumably, or else you'd have picked it up. But less obvious, the example I normally use, we'll come back to the volcano, but the example I normally use is man struck by lightning on golf course. So why is that well, it's a disaster, someone got struck by lightning, but why is that an information management disaster? Well, let's look at why was he there? Was he there because he ignored the weather forecast? Was he there because the weather forecast was wrong? Thunder and lightning wasn't forecast, and then so he went on the golf course, and then there was thunder and lightning. Did he ignore it because he didn't trust the weather forecast? You can see as soon as you start talking about it and the information that he would have needed to make an appropriate decision not to be on the golf course, that it's an issue with the information and whether it's of the appropriate quality. And it's the same with the volcano and the town at the bottom of the volcano that gets destroyed. If you knew that at a certain time on a certain day that the volcano was going to erupt, you'd make jolly sure there was no one in the town, and you'd very possibly choose not to build the town there at all in the first place, if you know that those things are going to happen. And it's a lack of the quality of our information, never mind, and setting aside for the moment that actually knowing when a volcano is going to go off is not a trivial exercise. That's not the point here. It's that you don't have the information, and it's not of sufficient quality, that means that that disaster is a possibility. So, of course, that disasters are at an extreme end of the information management spectrum, and things going wrong in information management. You can have much simpler things like over-ordering paper clips at the other end of the spectrum. You know, you weren't aware of, you know, just what the stock was, and you had mislaid, and so you ordered paper clips when actually there were paper clips there. You just hadn't had the right information to locate them. So it can be trivial or it can be huge. But things going wrong, mistakes and combinations of mistakes, and eventually they get to be disasters, are things that are caused by not having the right information. I think if you look at some of the COVID stuff that you've been doing there, and think through that lens, you know, why did this happen? Then you can start to see, you know, what would have been the information I would have needed in order to prevent that, and why was it I didn't have that, and what would I have needed to do, would have been, I think, quite interesting. And I'm just going to talk about my other favourite disaster example briefly, which is the Grenfell Tower disaster, because I think this is almost classic, where we really could have. This is much more in the Mars lander scenario, where there's really no excuse. So, in case you're not an Anglophile, I think it's 3 or 4 years ago now, a tower block in London went up in flames and 72 people were killed. The tower block went up because the cladding on the outside of the tower was flammable. It wasn't supposed to be, but it was deemed to have passed a test for flammability, and so it was used on that tower block, and in fact on hundreds of others as well, throughout the country, as it turned out afterwards. So there's an immediate question, was which other tower blocks had the same cladding, and because we didn't have good information held as data so that it could be easily queried, rather than taking half an hour to an hour to find that out, it took about 3 months, and even then they weren't quite sure they'd found all the tower blocks, things that qualified as tower blocks, which I think was over 6 stories high, I think, counted for these purposes. And it's about how quickly can you get out at the end of the day once the building is on fire. But the real question here isn't, I mean, that's almost a side issue. The real point is that because there wasn't sufficient transparency, you know, the data should have been available, and arguably was, but in such an untransparent way that it was possible for people to palm off the cladding that was used as being fit for purpose when, you know, quite clearly wasn't. And one needs to be careful about, you know, just how that happened exactly, because that, I think, is still to be determined. But you know, it was sold as meeting a certain safety criterion, which it in practice did not actually meet. And there was a problem about the testing and how that had been set up to suggest that it was actually safe enough. If with the right information management and the right level of transparency and the lack of opacity, it would have been clear to see that that was the case. And so you would never have put the cladding on the building in the first place. and then you wouldn't have had a disaster. Now, in addition to the 72 lives lost, that has so far cost some £12 billion, so $15+ billion, trying to rectify the cladding on other tower blocks. That's significant, both in terms of loss of life and the financial cost. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to say about that. And then there was just a little bit about information. So I've now got a couple of slides I'll use. Now what's happened? Has that gone? There we go, that's that. Now I have to work out how to
screen share with the green.
Share the screen. Let me just, sorry, I'm getting there.
Good. There's a green one.
Share screen, there it is, got it. And if I share, where's it gone, that one, I think. I share that, then we should be okay.
Yeah,
so
we see.
I wanted to this is about partly, this is mostly about improving semantics of information, and it's a key part of how you add value to information. So over on the left, you start, and this is the digitalization process. So you start with things that are unknown. So, you don't know the age of a tree, well, typically until you cut it down and you can count the tree rings. So, but the information is hidden there in the tree rings, and it's unknown. There's the known stuff, which is stuff we've collected somehow or other. How many blades of grass are there in my lawn? Another piece of information which is just unknown and is going to remain that way. So information that we have might start in our brains, or there might be on paper with writing, for example, some form of hard copy. And then we're looking to move it into computers. And initially that might be unstructured, like an image of some sort. And then we want to move that to being structured. And I was struck by something Elon Musk said in a recent presentation, that there are two sort of major divisions in terms of what they're trying to do with their full self-driving software. One of them is moving from photons coming in to vector space. And he said that's the difficult bit. Once you've got it in vector space, which is objects and velocities and that sort of thing, and objects that you can identify and which you've picked out of these photons and the image that you've got. That it's relatively easy once you've got it there. I'm glad to say that I'm doing the easy bit then. Or what I've been involved with is the easy bit. So that gives you structured data, and it can start just being syntactic, so some sort of text document. Semantic, you start with implicit semantics, where you've just got some columns but no headings really. Anything there is in your head. And then you have explicit semantics, when you have initially perhaps data with a basic data model, and we would call it grounded if you have data grounded in a top-level ontology, so that you added the maximum precision to what you're talking about. And then oh, hang on, let's how do I get this thing to move on? Let's go on to that version. When you got your information up into the high quality area, and getting it down into that bottom right hand corner is what data quality is really about achieving. Amongst, it's not the only thing, because there is things like accuracy and timeliness that are beyond that are not just the semantic part of it. But for the semantics, that's the key piece. So some benefits of quality information are automation. So you'll be able to automate deterministic processes. You can reduce costs. You can do process intensification and disruption. The example I tell here is when I started work, we still had, well, we didn't have secretaries, but we did have a typing pool. So if I wanted to write a note to distribute to other people, I would handwrite it and hand it in, and the next day it would be typed up and returned to me. I would go through it and check spelling and grammar and get the corrections. It would go through that. Then I would photocopy it, and part of the note was the names of the people it was going to go to. And so I would photocopy the appropriate number of copies and highlight the name that each copy was supposed to go to and put it in my out tray. Well, of course, today we do that with email, and it doesn't take 3 or 4 days to get something out. It takes 3 or 4 minutes to, well, no, maybe more than that if you've had to think about it. But let's say half an hour to an hour to write a reasonably meaty email. And that's process intensification. The other thing that I haven't mentioned here actually is de-skilling. Automation can help you de-skill. So when you put a welding robot on a car production line, you don't just, one of the things that you do is de-skill the task so that you don't need a skilled welder anymore. You only need someone who can load the welding machine with welding rods. So, and that's also something, and that can be useful because that releases your skilled people to do other things. Then you have reduced costs. You'll just be able to use the information provided to you. One of the big problems with data science and people who do data science is that they spend something like 70 to 90% of their time wrangling the data that they're trying to use. If you've got quality information, you can just use it, and you eliminate that cost of wrangling. And of course, making mistakes creates waste. Think in terms of the cost for the Mars lander, you had to send another one up there. In terms of the cost of recladding all those high-rise buildings because they've got the wrong cladding on them, or at the other extreme, you've got more paper clips than you needed unnecessarily. You're carrying more stock of paper clips than you actually needed. Okay, maybe you're not going to worry quite so much about that last one, but mistakes come in all sizes. So better informed decisions reduces the risks of making mistakes, and that reduces waste. Understanding remaining uncertainty in decisions. So if you know what the quality of your information is, and very often we don't know what the quality of our information is, then you can start to, that gives you a good clue on what the uncertainty in the data is. Are these temperatures plus or minus 1 degree Celsius or plus or minus 0.01 degrees Celsius? And if you're trying to control the temperature, that can be important. Indeed, I can recall an occasion when we had to replace the sensors in a reactor because the original sensors turned out not to be sensitive enough to give us the control that we needed. You'll have greater agility because you can anticipate disruptions and pivot to take advantage of them. If you can see what's coming because you are better informed and you're better able, and your models of how things are going to turn out are better, you can anticipate the disruptions and as it says, pivot to take advantage of them. This really puts you ahead of the competition. And you can see it happening. Actually, the pandemic was a really good example, I thought, of you could see that some organizations were able to see what the opportunities were and what needed to be done and set about doing it. So I have a yacht, and so I discovered that my sailmaker had pivoted to making PPE, so masks, the visors, and well, visors in particular, because he had the right tools that he could repurpose to make those, and so that was a great benefit to everyone. You'll have better insights into your operations as assets, and this will enable innovation. You need to establish a continuous improvement, and if you don't have the information about what's going on, you can't see where things are starting to go wrong, and you can't start to do the improvements. You're waiting for the disaster, for things to go wrong and the waste, rather than anticipating things going wrong and preventing the waste. You have the confidence that comes from knowing you're in good shape rather than hoping you are. And confidence counts because it means you feel able to act rather than frightened to act because you don't know what's going to happen. And of course, the information that you have might be something that you can sell. An interesting example here is that if you're an infrastructure or major asset owner, own an oil refinery or something like that, the maintenance information that you gather about the equipment that you use is likely to be valuable to that equipment manufacturer. And you can probably do a deal with them, about reduced costs of support for giving them feedback on the performance of their equipment. And of course, most of us do deals with supermarkets and other stores. When we have a store card and we get a small discount for it, we're effectively selling our data about us to them in exchange for whatever those discounts are. So we have something that is valuable for them, and they give us something in return. And you'd better believe that they realise that's the trade they're doing. We might not, but they certainly do. So then there are, now there's I think it's a book called Informatics that a guy I think called David Lane. No, that's the wrong name. It's not that. That's someone else. He's a roboticist. Anyway, there was a book I was reading, and after reading it, I kind of picked out that there were 4 values of information that it would be useful to know about. The first one is just simply the cost. This is the usual accounting of resources used to produce a product. Then there's the value realized, and this is the value from the use you are making of your data. So that's those things you're actually managing to achieve on the left. And you ought to be able to get a decent idea of that, or else how do you know that you're getting value for money for the cost, which you certainly should know what it is. Then you've got the potential value. That's the value you're missing from the data you have that is not being used where it could be. This happens a lot, for example, when you're sharing data. So think about that example of sharing data with the equipment supplier, which you might not be doing and might not have thought of doing. And unmet and possibly unknown information requirements, both inside and outside your organization. So, there might be information that if you had it, it would help you make better decisions and improve your performance, yet you don't have it. And you don't realize that you don't have it, perhaps. Or maybe you do, but you just don't know what to do about it. And then finally, there's what I call the asset strippers value. So if your company went bankrupt, your organization went bankrupt or went into liquidation in some way, what could the liquidators sell your data for? What value could they get for it? And you could imagine, for example, that your customer data might be valuable to some of your competitors. Whether even the liquidator would be able to sell it is a different matter, but it would certainly be valuable. And there might well be other data that you have that would be valuable to competitors who would be prepared to pay for it, or people who aren't your competitors even. So those are the 4 values of information. Those are the benefits of information. And again, why disasters are really caused by a lack of quality of information. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Excellent. I have some questions on the chat board, but I'll wait till
Please read them.
I will read them, but let's see if others have questions in the meantime. Anyone, please unmute yourself.
Hi, I think a distinction you made there, very important, should be added to Ken's overview of disasters is there's nature doing its thing. And then there's, in some cases, nature does its thing and we need quality information to respond to nature doing its thing. And then there are cases where we're doing something that leads to a disaster. So I agree with your basic premise there. I think that should be folded into the overview. The information quality, as you said, has several facets. There's taking the proper measurements. There's using the right models to make predictions from the measurements. And there's the communication of these to the appropriate people. So everything you've said here really helps with, it's fortuitous for the overview session. I don't have a particular question, but I really appreciate how that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and yes, I agree. I did a presentation, I think about this time last year, when I talked a bit more about the critical properties of information from the perspective of taking decisions, because there are lots of properties that data has that, like its format, which don't actually help the decision maker. But things like accuracy and availability and timeliness and provenance, clarity and relevance are things that do. So understanding those in the round, and I was really talking mostly about the semantic. So it's around consistency and clarity that I was talking about today, focusing on that because semantics is really the main interest of this group.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you feel that OWL, with the work that's been done in OWL so far, it's provided you the full top-level infrastructure? I don't mean top level as in top. Well, do you feel like you've been provided the infrastructure to make the types of inferences that and things you want to look at? Where
I struggle with OWL. I've attempted to use it a great deal. But the program I'm working on has kind of backed into RDFS and RDF as being the kind of backbone of what we're doing. That moving into OWL gives restrictions, but doesn't really enable, what's the right word? Well, doesn't give for the limitations it puts on you. It doesn't give you enough in return. But we're not concerned so much about reasoning as we are about data sharing data within and across organizations. So you would, if we wanted to do something with OWL, we would consider that probably a standalone application. And then it would need to be determined that OWL was the right environment to do that in. For us, the key reason for ontologies is to quality assure the data using the ontology, and the axioms to quality assure the data to make sure it's compliant, and to achieve semantic interoperability by enabling consistency of data from different sources. Those are our primary motivations.
And that verification and consistency can usually be done on the local ontology then without.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, Well, what we need is an overarching ontology that data is translated into so that it can be seamlessly shared. So we would normally be translating out of a local ontology. We'd normally be translating out of a local ontology into our foundation ontology.
Dr. West, I have a question, couple of questions.
Go ahead.
The point is that obviously we have to think of two types of disasters, ones which we can predict and ones which we can't predict. Of course, you could even model a hypothetical future pandemic and be prepared for it with available information as of now. But even the SARS-CoV did not give us enough information. It gave us a good start. So we could reduce the vaccine time to a year or something like that. But sometimes we don't have a clue of what type of disaster will come. So we should have just general information stored and be semantically available. But then there are others, like you are in a valley and there is a landslide possible. So you can calculate and keep your info at hand as to what to do when something like landslide happens. So how do you categorize these two kinds? And does your framework that you suggested in slide 1, does it address both types?
No, that's just about how do you move your data, how do you move your information to the semantically richest and most precise form so that you can get more out of it, more value out of it.
So the emergency.
I think that just to come back to your question or what you were saying, there are, when you're looking for information, one of the things that you're looking for are what are the existential threats. And only when you recognize there's an existential threat can you do something about it. But, you know, therefore the information about what are existential threats is some of the information that you want. And obviously when you don't know what all the existential threats are, and possibly don't even know what they are, then you know, you can be caught out, and that's part of the whole thing. But I think with COVID, for instance, it's interesting that really we did know that there was a possible existential, well, not existential quite threat, but for the human race, but something that was going to kill a lot of people at least. We knew that that possibility was there, and we had more or less sidelined work to do it because it didn't seem to be, you know, oh, it won't happen this year. It seemed to be the attitude because it hadn't happened for a few decades, something like that hadn't happened for a few decades. We forget, and this is classic human behavior, by the way, is that you notice that there's a threat, you respond to it, the actions that you take mitigate the threat, so you assume the threat's no longer there and stop doing the mitigation, and then the disaster happens. I could give a number of examples of that cycle taking place.
Sure. I understand we are short of time on this subject, especially on the subject of your talk, but except for how it enters the synthesis session related comments that you have made. Thank you, Doctor. But one last comment is, last comment is often the periodicity of those disasters exceeds active human lifetime. So younger people come into fray, 20, 30 years, they go away, but disaster cycle is 100 years. So it occurs every 2-3 generations.
That's
and
right.
People recall it. So
that's it. That's how towns get built at the bottom of volcanoes.
Yes.
Yeah, and again, that's classic of that kind of cycle. Sometimes we do well though. So, for example, you know, we had I don't know whether we'd always had them and just not noticed them, but at a certain point in the last, I think it was particularly after the tsunami that hit Indonesia, I think in the early noughties.
Yes, there are.
But since then, some effort has been put into putting tsunami warning buoys in.
Yes.
Notice a tsunami in action and enable warnings to be given.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's been really quite successful. I won't say universally, but it's been really made a difference.
These new capabilities have come because we had experience with one large tsunami. You're right. But I would like to request now that we open our forum to more general synthesis, and Gary has made a comment on the chat board for Ken to include the Mark Fox talk. Yeah, I understand you want to speak. Now, next is Todd. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Ravi. Matthew, one point, some of your examples conflated the existence of information with the communication thereof. Was that intentional?
Well, clearly the information needs to get to decision makers and support appropriate decisions. But that's the purpose of information, is to support taking decisions. Well, sorry, it's not the only one. It's in these kinds of situations, the purpose of information is to support decisions. So if it doesn't get to those who are making decisions, then it's part of the missing information and is therefore not quality. So it all revolves around decision makers.
Okay, thank you.
And remember, those don't need always to be really important people. Generally, the person that orders the paper clips is as unimportant as I am.
But I mean, I would say that there would be a general education and training in semantic query by the various agencies that have to deal with the aftermath, so that they are semantically prepared to ask the right question and get the right information on the fly. So there is some improvement in the training skills of the agencies involved. That is implied in your talk.
Yes, indeed, skills and a whole range of skills needs to be improved. And these go from people identifying the information requirements for the decisions they're going to need to make, so that those requirements are indeed fulfilled by those who create the information, through to getting the semantics right, through to people who bring it into that grounded semantic state that means that you have the best chance of being able to exploit the semantics in the information. And then the things like the timeliness and the clarity and the relevance, all of those things, so that you're bringing the information to the decision makers when they need it. And they know about the provenance, so that they can judge the uncertainty involved with using the information. All of that stuff needs to come together. That we had quite a good paper. I'll put a link on skills to support information.
Very good, very good. And also any comments on digital twins?
Yeah, digital twins. I think that digital twins are going to be important, but the problem with digital twins, and particularly sharing digital twins, is that the first thing that you learn generally is how poor quality your data is, because most people's data is created for local use. And you know the context, and you know that that sensor went down last week, so you should ignore the information that came from that one. But as soon as you start sharing that with others that don't have that local context, then you're in trouble, because you know, if they don't know not to use the data from that sensor. So when you move data, when you share data, particularly things like provenance and stating what the accuracy is, you know what the accuracy is, but you now have to state what the accuracy is. You have to state what the timeliness is. You have to, you know, the semantics have to be agreed across both organizations, not just in your head. All of those things have to happen. So you need to improve the quality of your information significantly. If you do improve the quality of your information significantly, then in my experience, digital twins will kind of emerge naturally. If you try to create a digital twin without addressing information quality at a foundational level, you might produce something as a one-off, but it's really quite unlikely that it will last for long, because the data quality issues and the technical deficit you have in those data quality issues will mean that it will either not be trusted or not be maintainable as things change over time.
Thank you.
You need to get the information management, the information quality issues sorted at the ground level.
West. Sorry to interrupt you, but we have
That's okay.
like 5-10 minutes for the synthesis questions that are coming on the chat board from Janet, Gary, and others. So Ken and everybody, including Dr. West, let's get involved in the synthesis discussion. To me, I have only one quick comment, namely synthesis should include analysis and identification of gaps. And certainly can your framework type of slide, the one which is looking at common threads among all speakers, is a good start to do that. Thank you. Gary and Janet, you have comments on the chat board. Thank you, Dr. West.
Yeah, it's a start. But Gary mentioned that I didn't include
Mark Fox
in this because I didn't, he wasn't one of the pandemics track speakers, but in retrospect, it's true, we should have.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, there is a nice slide that Mark has that I will update my slides and include that, and hopefully I can also include those slides that you put up, Matthew.
Yes.
So this is Gary. I have to go to another meeting, an ESIT meeting I usually miss because of a conflict here. But I just wanted to say in passing that much of what we heard from Matthew and it was discussed can be part of an introductory section on the conceptualization of disaster itself, following which we will get into some of the formalization models. So I think that's useful. And at the other end of the synthesis, I think some of what, again, Matthew and the discussion was, gets on more digital issues. So I think that while they may not be in the middle portion of our synthesis and communique eventually, there's a place for that type of discussion at the discussions section or the conclusion section or for the work section. So those are my two suggestions for using some of this input.
Thank you, Gary. Good one. Janet?
Yeah, I was thinking similarly, and that on the one hand, this talk helps to frame what is needed in information management, information quality management for disasters, whether one is able to automate and digitize or not. So, and then there's the question of automating as much as you can in an appropriate, high quality way. So that it has a nice two-part, leads you in. First, you think through what the requirements are, and then then you add in the digital automated side.